So the morning's two interventions, to some extent, were provided maps for reading the situation that we find ourselves in and for beginning to navigate the territory. And I was a bit concerned. I welcome, of course, and I'm happy to have seen those two, to have heard those two mappings. But I'm a bit more interested in the ways in which those maps may actually mismap the territory and the way that we need to question some of those readings. I would have liked to have engaged a little bit with Gita, and I hope that we will have the chance to do so. Because I found myself strangely finding it's like reading a guide to a territory which you don't see any bearings from the advice that you're being given. At the same time that Gita was asking us to be careful of block thinking and of homogenization and so on, she was doing exactly the same thing when she talked about, for example, Muslim participation in the anti-war movement, or the way that MAB somehow was, this powerful block Muslim vote that was part of the process, and marginalizing and shutting down others that were excluding their voices. And I think that we need especially to relativize the kinds of, I think it's extremely important that she points out, and all of us point out, all the forms of violence within as well as external to communities, of course. And if Muslim women who are in the UK are being targeted for not wearing the veil, that is something that, as she says, has to be spoken about. But at the same time, we have to ask, to what extent is it really the case that we should look at the example of Bangladesh, for example, and ask for the state legislature to pass laws to deal with that problem. So we would have a mirror image of the kind of thing that is happening in countries where they are wanting to legislate on the wearing of the niqab, and then there's 18 women in the whole country that wear the niqab. I mean, we have to put these things into context and see to what extent are we actually asking for state measures to deal with issues that are civil society ones. I'm also particularly concerned that we should always be careful to remember the contestation that goes on in relation to this continuous trope about the self-appointed leaders and all that kind of thing. So on the one hand, she and many people denounce the self-appointed leaders, and on the other bemoans the fact that a particular individual, and I wouldn't necessarily need to name him, but since he was named, Dr. Ghayastuddin Siddiqui, for example, may have been shut down of debates because he's a progressive voice. I mean, we need to ask the same questions. In other words, how representative is he of voices within the community? What are the processes of contestation that go on within any claims to representativity? And any group that is going to lay claim to a name is going, or any groups that lay claim to a name are going to contest for representation in relation to that. I think that we have to be especially careful when we talk about the question of who gets into bed with government and who gets into bed with the left, and then we leave out the rest of the picture. So if it is the case that certain members of particular movements of Muslim Brotherhood and so on have got into bed with the left, we cannot at the same time pass in silence the kinds of complicities and entanglements of people in the left and of formerly of the left who have realigned in relation to Islamophobic agendas. And I think that's probably much more important, in the sense that we mustn't culturalize this. We have to put this in terms of power, socioeconomic forces, and who actually has power on the ground. So I'm particularly concerned that we should be careful of anecdotal references as a way of mapping the terrain, and more importantly, we need to be careful of circular kinds of tautological presentations where we say things like Islamophobia protects Islam, and we move on from there. When we know that Islamophobia is an extremely contested concept, and one that does work as part, it works through contestation, no more, no less so than racism, anti-Semitism, all these kinds of terms that can be used to shut down debates as well as to open them up, and it's no more exceptional than any of the others. So when we say, for example, when we're told that it's been used strategically by the Jamaat and the government to shut down debates, I'd actually like to see some evidence of that, because we can always say that, and that immediately posits the debate in terms of, okay, so we must be wary of this term because it becomes an instrument for doing something that's oppressive. What about the uses that it's put to do the other work, to do the work of working for social justice, the work of actually eliminating forms of oppression and inequality? So basically what this panel addresses, that one tries to sort of imagine from the title what we ask to speak to. And so I just have a few points that I hope to make within my remaining 10 minutes. basically, I think that the overwhelming strand that characterizes the present times is the targeting of Muslims. And this is something that is present from state practices with surveillance, detention, control, and so on, through highbrow politics, political commentators, pundits, and all the way to the extreme right and the EDL and so on. And we need to see the kinds of articulations that are established in the circularity of concepts and of ideas and of political power that crosses this otherwise apparently very separate social forces. And these kinds of expressions of targeting of Muslims are very directly connected with the concept of belonging. And I say that because whenever we have a conference and it has a theme, we always try to sort of make the connection with the theme. But it's obviously true. The trope of belonging is used in the context of this targeting of Muslims, both at the level of the classic racist demand to the niqabbed woman in the street, go back to your country, to the more subtle forms of expression of the notion of belonging in culturalized terms, which ends up producing the kind of discourse that, as Gary Young puts it, the Guardian journalist, Muslims essentially have to pledge in advance their belonging to the West in order to then have the spaces of contestation and to articulate what their own voices are. Now, what complicates matters, of course, in navigating this terrain of the targeting of Muslims is that the ground has shifted from under us, from the sort of classic grammars of race and the race relations industry and the concepts of what the solidarities of anti-racism were, to the present, in part because of war on terror, but not only. It's a multiply complicated field which involves many different kinds of shifts that we need to look at. So when a racist spits at a woman who's wearing the niqab and tells her to go back to Pakistan, this is to some extent reinforced, given legitimacy, by the kinds of comments that Jack Straw makes about whether niqab impedes or does not impede communication, or by the fact that state legislatures in various European countries are discussing whether or not to ban the niqab. There is a relation between these kinds of things, what happens in the street in terms of violent political acts and the kinds of circulation and acceptability of certain debates at a higher level, which in turn then trades on. It does not eliminate in any way, it doesn't mean that we have to be any less critical of, but it trades on and is informed by racialized discourses on the notion of oppression, patriarchy, communitarianism, self-segregation, extremism, alienness, suspicion. These kinds of things collude to produce simultaneously discourses of pity, repugnance, suspicion, and menace. And of course, at the same time that the victim is seen as oppressed, seen as all too powerful. Now, the same thing could be said around the debates about the stop the Islamification of Europe and the trope of Islamofascism, of course, and the campaigns for mobilization against the construction of mosques. And this, of course, again, goes all the way from the kind of scholastic, how many angels dancing on the pinhead in debates about what is the form and function of a minaret in terms of planning permissions and health and safety discussions and so on, all the way to the more sort of retrenchist populist debates about our urban landscape and our heritage and what is and is not a blemish on the landscape and what does and does not historically belong to the environment that we would like to continue to preserve.